All right, just a quick review of what we covered last week. Welcome again to the Georgia School of Preaching Spring Quarter 2018 class on Ephesians and Philippians. I want to very quickly go over the questions that I sent you by email as a review for this week's or last week's lesson. Did you get it? It's okay. It'll be up here. And it'll be on your email when you get home. That's okay. It's okay. I'll have the question here, and it'll be on your email when you get home. But it won't have the answers. You don't have the answers here. I'll be giving you the answers as we go, if you know them. When Paul writes the prison epistles from Rome, or Paul did write the prison epistles from Rome, what are the prison epistles? What are the names of the prison epistles? Actually, I did put the answers up there, so you're good to go. Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon are the prison epistles, or the epistles that he wrote while he was in prison in Rome. All right. Question number 2. At the end of which journey, I can't cover the answer up. At the end of which journey, missionary journey, did Paul end up in prison to write these letters? And that would be the third missionary journey. He left Antioch to go and collect money for the funds, or for the people in Judea. I think that's one of the questions. What was the main purpose of Paul's third journey? And that was to collect funds from Gentile churches to supply needs to the poor saints as a result of the famine there in Jerusalem. You don't get all that down, don't worry about it. You'll have time to write it. Actually, on the paper that I sent you at home, you're only going to get the question. So this is the copy. This is the answer that I'll be looking for. To collect funds from Gentile churches to supply the needs to the poor saints in Jerusalem. You might recall from the lesson, the prophet Agabus said there's going to be a famine during the time of, I think it's Clement of Rome, maybe Claudius of Rome, but anyway, there would be a famine. There actually, according to historians, 4 different famines during that time frame. Was it a reference to all those famines or just one of them? I don't know. Number 4. Other than satisfying a physical need, hunger, or the famine, why did Paul collect these funds? He was hoping to bridge the rift between the Gentile and Jewish Christians. Who was causing that rift? Who's causing that problem?
The Jews.
It would have been the Jewish Christians. They didn't understand how the gospel could go to Gentiles. And they didn't also understand some of the things that Paul was teaching about that the Jews would be giving up, that the Jewish system was coming to an end or had come to an end. So it was, the Jewish Christians didn't like a lot of things Paul said. And one of the things they didn't like was that he was offering the kingdom of God, which was Jewish in their way of thinking, to the Gentiles. Number 5. Almost didn't get that on the screen. Why or what did Christians throughout Paul's journey keep telling Paul? As he's going on his missionary journey, collecting those funds, he would meet with the brethren, and they would say, what? Won't be trouble for you, Paul. Mm-hmm. We've been hearing, or maybe they had received a word from the Spirit himself, that you will be bound, you'll be in prison when you reach Jerusalem. You want to be in trouble.
That's when you started talking about the Spirit. I think you said something about that you were talking about the Spirit told Paul to.
Oh. The Spirit had talked to Paul. The Spirit had talked to, well, in I think chapter 20 or 21, verse 4, we talked about where the people, the brethren there, spoke in the Spirit to Paul saying, don't go. And the Spirit had told Paul on another occasion, go. So if both those are referring to the Holy Spirit, then there's some contradiction there. And I don't think there's contradiction. I think probably the brethren there, and I forget what town it was. I want to say Troas, I'm not sure. The brethren there in that city were speaking from their own spirit, having heard what's going to happen, from the Spirit, maybe they're saying, don't go. If he's saying you're going to be in prison, if you're going to get in trouble, Paul, we love you, man, don't go. In Ephesus, well, I think it was Ephesus, Paul said, no, it wasn't Ephesus, but wherever it was, he told them on another occasion, that y'all quit doing this. You're breaking my heart.
Yeah.
This is my mission from God. I've got to go.
It's more like a personal concern, I would say.
I think so. Question number 6. What was Paul's attitude toward his future imprisonment? Spirit says it's going to happen. Brethren say it's going to happen. Don't go. What was his attitude? I'm going even if I have to die for the Lord's sake. He's not interested in just throwing himself on an altar. He's not interested in just throwing himself down to be killed, but he's willing to die for the Lord's sake. And then finally, how did the church receive Paul? This is where we left off last week in the hour that we had. Apologies to all involved that we only had an hour class last week. That was my thinking that we're supposed to have 1 hour. I was wrong. It's supposed to be 2. But anyway, at the end of our hour, we were talking about Paul finally made it to Jerusalem. The church there received him, James and the elders. How did they receive him?
We're glad to see him.
1, they were glad to see him. They rejoiced at his report of his work among the nations. And I'd like for you to think about that word nations. It's just a synonym for Gentiles. We always use the word Gentiles. People today don't know what Gentiles means. And it's just another word for nations. Anybody that's not Jewish is a Gentile, or anybody that's not Jewish is from among the nations. And that's just all the word means. It's just a word that developed over the years. Gentile is a word developed over the years to refer to anybody that's not Jewish. And number 3, they informed him that myriads, the word myriads in the Greek means tens of thousands, lots of folks, of believing Jews, notice it's believing Jews, were zealous for the law, and they were in town for the feast, most likely the Pentecost, not the first one in AD 33, this is AD 57. They were zealous for the law in time for the feast, and they had heard that Paul was teaching an anti-Semitic gospel. What does the word anti-Semitic mean?
Against him.
I don't like Jews. Semitic is a word for the people who come from Shem, Noah's son Shem, and that would be the Jewish nation, generally speaking, but anybody who came from that Shemitic bloodline would be Semitic, but in the Bible, they don't use the word anti-Semitic, but the idea is there that they believed Paul was teaching their gospel against the Jews or the Jewish kingdom, which we would use today. We would say it's anti-Semitic today. All right, that's it for our review. These reviews and the quizzes I'll send you, I'll try to send these earlier in the week. Maybe today's Thursday. I should hope that I would get them to you by Friday or Saturday. I did not do that this week. I just sent them to you today. So that's the reason you don't have it yet.
Okay, because I looked on my
You didn't miss it. It just it came probably around 1 or 2 o'clock or something like that.
Okay, that's why I didn't see it.
So it's not your fault that you don't have it. It's my fault, and I apologize for that. That's my slothfulness, and there's no excuse for it. But that's what it was. All right, let's go back to my other notes. That's not it. Let's see what it is. All right. Going back to Acts chapter 21, for those of you who weren't in the class last week, let me just real quick catch you up. This is the book of Ephesians class, Ephesians and Philippians class. That's also what we're doing now is introducing the prison epistles in general. Before we get to actually the text of the book of Ephesians, I want to understand why the book of Ephesians or the letter of Ephesians is called a prison epistle. Same thing with Philippians, Colossians. We're mostly concerned with Ephesians and Philippians right now. But our goal in this first couple of weeks is to find out how Paul ended up in prison. That's what we've been doing. We've been going through the last part of the book of Acts very briefly, very quickly, trying to find out how Paul got to prison. In Acts chapter 20, verses 20, or 21, verse 20, beginning, and when they heard it, they glorified the Lord. That is, when they heard Paul's report, the good things he had been doing among the nations, among the Gentiles, they glorified God. And they said to him, you see, brother, how many myriads of Jews there are who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law, but they have been informed about you that you teach all Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses. You teach an anti-Semitic law or a gospel, saying that they ought to not circumcise their children, not walk according to the customs. What then? The assembly must certainly meet, for they will hear that you have come. What's going on? Well, Paul's come to town, to Jerusalem, during the feast day. Thousands and thousands of Jews have gathered. They're going to hear that Paul, the apostle of the Gentiles, or the nations, has come, and they've been hearing from various sources, not very good sources apparently, that Paul teaches against the Jews, against the temple, against Moses, against the Jewish traditions that they have been observing for 1,500 years. There seems to be indicated anyway to me that the Jerusalem church is not so much concerned about the gift that Paul brought. It's not even mentioned. Paul, I don't know how much relief he had brought from the Gentile churches, but I know that from the record in 1 Corinthians and other places that it was considerable sacrifice that these churches have made to help the Jews in Jerusalem. But when Luke records the meeting of the Jews or the Jerusalem elders and Paul, it's not even mentioned. The concern is more about the rumors concerning Paul's work than the generosity of the Gentiles. So who's causing this dissension?
The Jewish Christians?
Jewish Christians. I think it's important to remember these are Jews who have believed, who are zealous for the law. They're so zealous, they're allowing it to become divisive. Their zealousness to become divisive. Yes,
They call it Judaizers.
Judaizers would be a reference to not so much these believing Jews, but Jews who really despised Paul's teaching, and they chased Paul down from city to city. They were Jewish leaders from the synagogues who didn't believe, would be my guess.
Okay. And
And they came to the places where Paul was. Some of them could have been Jews who were converted, who were zealous for the law. We'll meet two kinds of Jews. We'll have believing Jews who are zealous for the law. We'll have unbelieving Jews who are zealous for Judaism. We'll see some of that going on as well. But I think this ultimately is the work of Satan.
Mm-hmm.
God's kingdom is coming into this world, and it's going to happen, and Satan is not going to just lay down and let it happen. We're going to read in the book of Ephesians chapter 6 that we have to take up armor, the armor of God. Why? Who are we fighting against? Not flesh and blood, but who? Principalities, powers, darkness. We're fighting against Satan, and that's what Paul's doing here. He's fighting against Satan. So we're getting a taste here of what Paul's going to be teaching us about in the book of Ephesians. He's a liar. He wants people to believe the lie rather than see the truth. The truth is the Gentile nations, churches in the Gentile nations, have done a great, wonderful thing to bridge this gap between the two peoples, the Jews and the Gentiles. The lie is Paul's going around teaching folks that Jews have to quit worshiping God, have to quit their circumcision, have to quit their traditions, they have to give up everything that's Jewish, and that's just simply not true. Apparently the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem strongly believed that Jewish Christians could and probably should maintain their Jewish traditional practices. And I would say they are not wrong on that. There's nothing wrong with a Jew practicing circumcision because he's Jewish. Mm-hmm. And I don't think there's anything wrong with the Jew keeping the Sabbath day unless he's keeping it for the reason or for a Jewish reason that they don't believe the kingdom has come yet. Paul, or the Hebrew writer, would teach us that we have a Sabbath of rest, but he's not talking about the Sabbath day. He's talking about, I think, there's a couple of interpretations on that. I'm not going to go there because that's not our study. I could get off base. So the Jews had several traditions. We'll read of one that Paul's going to be involved in just a moment, that they kept, and they didn't see anything wrong with keeping those traditions as well as being Christians. Now, Paul will talk about in the book of Colossians, and again, that's not our study, but he's going to talk about in the book of Colossians very strongly that you can't enforce the Judaistic practices, traditions, customs, and say that's part of Christianity. It's not part of Christianity. Now, if you want to circumcise your children, if you want to go to Pentecost in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost and celebrate that's wonderful. That's great. Paul did it. He wouldn't say that it's wrong to do it, but to do it as a matter of faith, where you say that this is what we have to do to be Christians, then it becomes a problem. And because that's what some of the Jews, believing Jews or unbelieving Jews, whichever the case it was, they wanted to enforce this upon the Gentiles. Okay, Paul, if you want the Gentiles to be in the church, fine, make them Jews. And Paul says, no, can't do that either. And that's part of the discussion in Acts chapter 15, but we won't go back to that for again. That's not our purpose. These were rumors. They were false rumors. James and the elders there were concerned that the Christians in Jerusalem and maybe the visiting Christians who had come from all over the world, Jewish Christians, would oppose Paul because of these rumors. As you read throughout Paul's epistles, you'll find that he constantly validates the moral law of God. He's not saying that in his teaching, he never said we need to disregard God's moral law. There's no record that he commanded Jewish communities to abandon their Jewish customs or rituals. On the contrary, he himself followed Jewish customs when he was in Jewish communities. We'll see that in the book of 1 Corinthians in just a moment. He did teach that with the death and burial and resurrection of Jesus Christ, a new age has dawned. And he wanted the Gentiles to understand that. They didn't understand the old age, so it wasn't a big deal for them. But he wanted the Jews to understand that. He explained in his epistles that neither Jews or Gentiles are required to maintain those Jewish traditions. Those Jewish traditions we'll find, Paul says, they were, in the book of Colossians, I believe it is, they were the shadow. The thing casting the shadow, the substance, the real thing that's casting the shadow, it's here. And that's the thing that we need to pay attention. Those things are just a shadow. They can't do anything for you. You want to celebrate Passover, you want to celebrate Pentecost, well, just go right ahead, but it's not going to do anything for you spiritually. That's just a holiday now. And nothing wrong with it. It's just you can't make it a matter of faith. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, we have this reading. For though I am free, this is Paul speaking, from all men, I have made myself a servant to all. I don't have to serve anybody, but I've made myself a servant to all that I might win the more. My purpose is what? That I might win the more. I make myself a servant to the Jews that I might become, and I become as a Jew. What does that mean? I do Jewish things Jewish ways. Because when I'm in a Jewish community, I'm a Jew, I'll do that. Why? That I may win the more. He's trying to influence them, not for Judaism, but for Christ, that I might win the Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law. I think those under the law is a reference to Jews who are Christians who still were thinking that they were under the law. Maybe the Jews here in the first part would be unconverted Jews. I think these under the law Jews were Jews that were converted, but they're still, the Old Testament, the 10th Commandment law, man, that's been in my life for 1,500 years. And so they're not fully understanding everything, or maybe they were, but they still wanted to keep that old law. I became as a Jew that I might win them. I became to those under the law as one under the law that I might win those who are under the law. Verse 21, to those who are without the law, as without the law, or as without law toward God, but under the law toward Christ. I think that's probably Gentiles. To them, I was as one without law. He's not saying I went around doing things illegally. He just was to them. He acted as if there was no Jewish law because those folks didn't understand that there was a Jewish law. Didn't understand much about it. Verse 22, to the weak I became weak, to win the weak, that I might have become all things to all men, that I might by some means save some. Now this I do, what? For the gospel's sake, that I may be a partaker of it with you. So Paul didn't hesitate to behave like a Gentile when he was with Gentiles. When he was with a Gentile, he'd eat a barbecue sandwich. When he was with the Jews, he wouldn't do that because it was forbidden. And he, as we talked about a little bit last week, he rebuked Peter because Peter, when he was with the Gentiles, he acted like the Gentiles, but if the Jews came, he separated himself from the Gentiles. And Paul said, no, wait a minute, Peter, you've missed the point, and you ought not do that. So he's happy to follow Jewish traditions for the sake of the gospel. The fact that Paul was in Jerusalem at this point, he's not only come there to bring in these funds, but I think it's not coincidental that he came there on the day of Pentecost. This was a high holy day among the Jews, and Paul came there because he knew there would be myriads of Jews there. He planned to be there for this time so he could celebrate this holiday with them, not so much to celebrate it, but he knew that that's what they would be doing, and I'll come there and be a Jew while among the Jews, and at the same time I will show them the gospel of Jesus Christ. God did not obligate Paul to maintain those Jewish traditions of the Old Testament law, but if Paul wanted to keep them for the sake of winning someone to the gospel, Paul, you just go right ahead. Paul says, I am free from all men. I don't have to do that.
But how, I mean, okay, we're talking about the believers and the unbelieving Jews, and the believing Jews still, wanted to be part of, they didn't give up the law fully. And so you're saying that Paul, when he was with them, he acted like a Jew. So are you saying that, how did he
was using
them? Help me understand.
I understand your question. He was using their knowledge of the law as a tool to bring them to Christ. That's what the prophets have been doing all along. They've been trying to help people see that the law is the calling of Israel was not the thing in and of itself. The thing in and of itself was the one that was to come from the Jews. And so Paul would essentially make friends with them. He would find their common grounds and then begin to build from that purpose. Now, he wouldn't be hypocritical and two-faced with you, I'll be a Jew, with you, I'll be a Gentile, but he would use the things that they would have in common. Paul was a Jew, reared up in Judaism, chief among the Jews. He knew it backwards and forward. So when he talked to a Jewish person, believing or unbelieving, as far as Christ is concerned, he knew where to start with that person. And he would come in on common ground with them. He would probably approach an unbelieving Jew differently than he would approach a believing Jew because they are at different starting points. The book of Hebrews was written to believing Jews who were thinking about going back to the law. And so he uses a lot of Jewish teaching, whoever it was that wrote the book, uses a lot of Jewish teaching and analogy to help them understand. You gave that up for a reason. What was that reason? Because it's no longer sufficient. So he used common ground. So I don't think Paul was being hypocritical in this or two-faced in this. I think he was just starting where they were. And he had the ability to do that because he knew Jewish traditions, he knew Jewish customs, he knew Jewish law. He says in Colossians chapter 2, does that answer your question?
Yes, it did.
Okay. In Colossians chapter 2, verse 16, he says, so let no one judge you in food or drink regarding a festival or a new moon or Sabbath. He's speaking to Gentile Christians. Don't let Jewish Christians come in here and tell you you have to observe the Sabbath or you have to observe the new moon as the Jews did, or a particular festival. If you want to celebrate those festivals, fine, but you don't have to do that to be a Christian. He says, those things, verse 17 we just mentioned, are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance, the thing casting the shadow, and has been for 1,500 years, is Christ. Then in verse 20, he says, if you died with Christ from the basic rudiments or principles of the world, most likely, in my mind anyway, a reference to the Jewish law, that it was the basic, the ABCs of the Jewish world or Jewish dispensation. He says, if you died with Christ from that, why are you living as though in the world do you subject yourselves to those regulations? Don't touch, don't taste, don't handle, which all concern things which perish with using according to the commandments and doctrines of men. These things indeed have a what? An appearance of wisdom in self-imposed religion, false humility, and neglect of the body, but are of no value against the indulgences of the flesh. The Jews were trying to make these religious practices what you need in order to go to heaven. Paul says, you don't need to go to heaven. It's going to do you of no value whatsoever as far as the indulgence of the flesh. He would go on in the book of Colossians and says, rather, set your mind on things above where Christ is. And that's all of Colossians chapter 3. We won't go there because that's not our book. It all ties together, but we can't linger too long in one place because we have to get to the book of Ephesians eventually. In short, Paul taught that the applications of God's law had changed now that the substance, Christ, has come. It was nevertheless still, in Paul's mind, acceptable for the Jewish people to continue in Jewish traditions as long as they didn't make them a matter of faith and bind them upon themselves or upon the Gentile or the nations. If by keeping Jewish traditions he could, going back to your question, open the door to teaching a Jewish person or a synagogue, a group of Jewish persons, the gospel, Paul had no issue with keeping those traditions. So James and the elders in Jerusalem, knowing or seeming to understand that this was Paul's demeanor, they came up with what they believed to be a solution that would satisfy the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. We're going back to Acts chapter 21. He says, this is James and the elders speaking, therefore do what we tell you. We've got an idea for you, Paul. Try this. We have 4 men who have taken a vow, most likely, in my opinion, anyway, the Nazarite vow. Can't prove that, doesn't matter. Whatever the vow was, they've taken a vow. Take them and be purified with them and pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads and that they may know that these things which were informed concerning you, so that the people, the Jewish people, these myriads of Jews, believing Jews who are questioning Paul, that they may know the things of which what they were informed concerning you are nothing, but that you yourself also walk orderly and keep the law. So James says, and the elders say, we know the law is not binding on us anymore, Paul. At least I'm assuming that they believe that. They are elders in the church. They are Jews and still working on themselves coming out of that Judaism. But I'm assuming for the moment that James and the elders believe that the law is nailed to the cross. Nevertheless, because we have these myriads of Jews and thousands of Jews who have been misinformed about you, that you're anti-Semitic, why don't you keep this vow or help these men keep this vow and you take the vow with them so that they'll see you're not opposed to Judaism in that sense. And so Paul, to demonstrate that he was not anti-Semitic by participating in the rituals, decided that he would do that. Paul's concern is not so much about the Jews for himself, but about his attitude, their attitude toward the Gentile churches. But he accepts the challenge, hoping that by doing this, the gift of money didn't seem to have a great effect. So maybe by doing this will settle the differences between the Jews and the Gentile churches. If they see that me, the preacher of the Gentiles, the one who's going to the Gentiles, I still believe in the law, or at least I still hold to the traditions.
So on this right here, did Paul cut his hair or did he grow hair?
I don't know the Jewish custom enough on that. If it's the Nazarite vow, they may start off by shaving their head and then not cutting it until the end of the vow. Mm-hmm. Or it may be at the end of the vow, this may be at the end of the vow that they are going to be purified and they're cutting the hair after. I don't know the answer to that question. There's not enough detail for me. Probably somebody more scholarly in Jewish traditions and customs would answer that question for you. I don't know the answer to that question. If this at the end of the vow or at the beginning of the vow, the shaving of the head, was it to get them started or was it at the end? I don't know. Some of those Nazarite vows were for life. You never could shave your head or cut your hair or eat raisins or anything like this. But so for the cause of Christ among the Jews, for the reconciliation of Jews between Jews and Gentile churches, Paul submitted to the judgment of the elders in this matter, and begin this week of purification. Whether it was a good plan or not is a matter for debate. Some people say that Paul shouldn't have done this. Some people go so far as to say that Paul sinned by doing that. It's not my issue. It's not an inspired plan. I don't know that anywhere we can say that God said to the elders at the church at Jerusalem, tell Paul to do this. It was just a plan that they developed trying to make the best of a bad situation. And fact is, it didn't work. You might say it even backfired, at least from a human perspective. To accomplish their human goal, their human-inspired goal, it failed. But you might say that there was some success from God's perspective, but we'll talk about that later on. Near the end of Paul's week of purification, he was spending time in the inner court of the temple. I think I have a picture of that. Yeah. This is a mock of the temple. If you go to Jerusalem, they have a big area where the old city of Jerusalem is made to scale. It's small enough that you can see it all in one. It's probably the size of 3 or 4 of these rooms, and you can see the people back here, the tourists. They're looking at us. That's how the size of it compared to reality. It's not real, but it's a picture of reality of what it was back during Jesus' day. So, according to their understanding, they had the inner court. This is where Paul was, that we'll read about in just a moment. But he was in the inner court. Out here is the outer court. If a Gentile goes past that door, he commits a crime worthy of death, according to Jewish law. And Romans, generally speaking, let them have their way on that. That's their sacred thing, and they let most deities do their sacred things. And if you violate their sacred rules, then you pay the price. But in this case, Paul's a Roman citizen, and if he had done that as a Gentile, then he would be first subject to Roman law, and the Jews couldn't touch him until Roman law says, okay, we're going to let you do this. But anyway, that's not the issue, because it's okay for Paul to be in here, but it would not be okay for Paul to take a Gentile in here. Now let's look what happened. I think I had this wrong in my... When the 7 days were almost ended, Jews from Asia. You have to look on your map to see where that is, but this is the place from which Paul had come. Maybe Ephesus, maybe not Corinth, but maybe some of the Philippians, Thessalonians, some of those churches that Paul had. Anyway, the Jews had been chasing Paul from city to city, trying to get him to stop teaching Jews, just like Paul had gone from city to city before he became a Christian, trying to kill Jewish Christians or stop them from believing in Christ. Well, there were Jews just like Paul doing the same thing, trying to persecute Paul, keep him from doing that. So Jews from Asia, seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd, laid hands on him, crying out, "Men of Israel, help! This man is one who teaches all men everywhere against the people, against the Jewish people, against the Jewish law, and this place, which would be the temple. Furthermore, he has brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place." Somebody says that Paul brought a Gentile into the holy place. Now, they hadn't got any witnesses of that, and there'll be a bone of contention later on. They had previously seen Trophimus, which would be a Gentile, a gentleman that Paul was with Paul from Ephesus. They had seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, with Paul in the city, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. Now, they hadn't seen nothing, but they supposed that, well, he was with Trophimus, who's a Gentile. I saw him that way last week, or saw him with him last week, and so it must be that he took him into the temple. And all the city was disturbed, and the people ran together, seized Paul, dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut.
So that was worthy of death on Paul's part too.
If he did that, in fact, according to Jewish law, they could, I guess, put both Trophimus and Paul to death for that offense, according to Jewish law. Now, in Jerusalem, Jerusalem is a occupied city, you might say, of the Roman law goes first. That's why Jesus had to go before Pilate, because Roman law goes first. The Jews can say, crucify him, and it's their law to do so if he was a blasphemer of God, but they got to get a crucifixion approved by the Roman official. So anyway, we have Paul being accused of taking a Gentile. This is the same area, this court of the Gentiles is the same area. You might remember Jesus one time was braiding a whip, and he called the Jews. He said, "You've made my father's house a den of thieves." And Jesus began turning over the tables, and because what they were doing is, this was the Gentile court, this whole area. People from the nations could come here and worship God. They couldn't go in there, but they could come here and worship God. But the Jews had set up tables, kiosks, you might say, all around here, and they were disturbing or preventing the Gentiles from worshiping. It was a marketplace, and they were literally making it a den of thieves, because if the guy brought his animal from a Jew had brought his animal, maybe even a Gentile who wanted to worship God according to Jewish law, had brought his animal to sacrifice, the Jews would say, no, good sheep, but it's not good enough. He's got a tick here, he's got a bump here. Here, you can't use him, but buy one of ours. Twice the price, but you can't make a sacrifice without it. So the guy wants to make a sacrifice, he says, no, all right, I ain't got any choice. And so he brings out his money, and he says, oh, that's Gentile money. You're going to have to exchange it for temple money, which the exchange rate for temple money was, twice the rate. And so the guy is getting poorer and poorer as he's standing there trying to worship God. And Jesus is seeing this go on.
Priests are making money.
Not only all these people setting up kiosks in there were making money, and they were all yelling over the other one. You got one guy over here doing it, one guy over here doing it, and it's like a circus. Not a circus, but what do you call it? The county fair. You got the hawkers out there. Come over here and buy mine. Come over here and buy mine. Well, that's what's going on. And that's not really our text, but Jesus, he's righteous indignation because they're making the house of God a den of thieves. So he drives them out like animals, because that's what they were acting like. And that's the same area where this was taking place. But Gentiles were allowed here, they weren't allowed there, and that's the accusation that took place in Acts chapter 21, verse 27 that we just read from a few moments ago. We talked about who the Jews were from Asia. They said that they had seen Paul with a man named Trophimus, a Gentile, and they just made the assumption that Paul had taken him into the temple. Later on, Paul would argue, you know what, you have no witnesses to that. There's thousands and thousands of people, myriads and myriads of Jews, and Paul says, show me one person who saw me take anybody in there. He couldn't come up with anybody, and that was one of Paul's, I think, strongest argument. We'll see that later on. No one stepped up to say I'm a witness. So what these Jews from Asia did, in my opinion, is outright lied. I don't think they made a mistake. I don't think they made a poor assumption. I think they just outright lied. They don't like Paul. They didn't like him before he got to Jerusalem. They don't like him now that he's in Jerusalem. And they just lied and made up this lie that Paul had taken this man in there. So they roused up the city against Paul. An angry mob now has dragged him from the court, intent on killing him. If the rumor was true, then killing Paul would have been exactly what the law said should have been done, or at least the Jewish law of that time said should have been done. But the commander of the Roman garrison, you got to understand why that Roman was there, why that Roman commander was there. He's there during a feast day. Now, they have Romans there all the time because Jerusalem was a Roman province, or Judea is a Roman province, capital city. So they keep Romans there for keeping the peace. But during the feast days, when Jews tend to get a little bit rowdy, they really were out in force, and they were trying hard to keep the peace. And so they hear an uproar taking place in the city. The Roman commander, if he doesn't go down there and squelch that, he's going to lose his job, maybe even his life, because that's his responsibility. So he rushes down there to quell the disturbance so that he doesn't get in trouble. When he comes on the scene, he sees Paul in the midst of this mob being torn apart, you might say. They're going to kill him if they can get away with it. And so he runs and takes Paul into custody, and that's where it says here, now as they were seeking to kill Paul, news came to the commander of the garrison that all Jerusalem was in an uproar. He immediately took soldiers and troops and chariots, ran down to them. They saw the commander and soldiers, and they stopped beating Paul. Then the commander came near and took him and commanded him to go down with 2 chains. He asked, who is he? What have you done? Some among the multitude cried one thing, some another. None of them knew really what was going on. It was a riot, it's a mob, and there's no sense to be made from any of it. So when he could not ascertain the truth because of the tumult, he commanded him to be taken to the barracks. When he reached the stairs, he had to be carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the mob. For the multitude of the people followed after him, crying out, away with him, which means let's kill him while we can. Verse 37 says that Paul was about to be led into the barracks. He said to the commander, can I talk to you for a second? May I have a word with you? He replied, can you speak Greek? Are you not the Egyptian who some time ago stirred up a rebellion and led 4,000 assassins out in the wilderness? Paul said, I am a Jew, from Tarsus, Sicily, a citizen of no mean city, which means it's a significant city. I'm not from the sticks. I'm not just a rabble-rouser from nowhere. I implore you, permit me to speak to the people. So when he had given him permission, Paul stood on the stairs and motioned with his hands to the people. When there was a great silence, he spoke to them in the Hebrew language.
Oh, Hebrew, Greek, everything.
Paul's a smart guy. He was schooled at the feet of Gamaliel. He was raised in a Grecian city. He knew Hebrew and Greek, and he probably knew, well, what's the almost Hebrew language? It's on the tip of my tongue. Can't see it. Aramaic, yeah. That's what most of the Jews probably spoke. Maybe you might say it's a perverted version of Hebrew. In Acts 22, Paul gives an account of his conversion. This is the end of Acts chapter 21, and the word saying there just goes right into chapter 22, where Paul gives that account of his conversion. Luke says that the Jews listened intently until he got down to the part where Paul said, Jesus said, I'm going to send you to the Gentiles. And that just started the fire all over again. It says in verse 22, and they listened to him until this word, and then they raised, that is the word that Paul says, Jesus said to Paul, I'm going to send you to the nations. And they said, away with this fellow from the earth. He's not fit to live. Then they cried out and tore their clothes and threw dust in the air. And the commander ordered him to be brought back into the barrack and said, he should be examined under scourging so that we might know why they shouted so. He must have done something wrong if he's causing this much uproar. This Roman can't understand the intensity of these Jews. If these Jews, it's a mob now, and they think, because they've heard a rumor or somebody started a rumor, they think Paul has taken someone into that temple. I believe these people who are throwing dust in the air are being provoked by the ones who lied, and they think it's the truth. They think it's what he did. But nevertheless, they are in such a state, the commander is thinking he must have done something. Take him out back, give him a lashing, and see if we can figure out if he will talk. Paul pointed out, however, I'm a Roman citizen. You can't scourge me until you give me a trial and I'm found guilty. And so the centurion backed up and didn't do that. On the following day, the commander, Claudius, Lysias is his name according to Acts 23, verse 26, he assembled the Jewish ruling body, which would be the Sanhedrin. We're not on your turf. We're in Jerusalem, but I want you to come to me and talk to me. When I'm not going to the temple. I'm not going to your synagogue. You come to me, and we're going to settle this matter. We're going to talk about this matter. So he brought the Sanhedrin, most likely, before the commander and presented Paul before them to discover the allegations against him. Apparently, no witnesses came forward to testify that Trophimus had entered the court of Israel. So Paul felt sort of like a free hand. You're not going to say what I did. You ain't got any proof. You ain't got any witnesses. So he began to defend himself by explaining why the Jews had taken such offense at what he said. Paul, looking earnestly at the council, most likely the 70, the Sanhedrin, he said, "Men, brethren, I've lived in all good conscience," we've heard this before God until this day. In other words, I have never knowingly violated God's law. Now, I did kill Christians, he would tell us in another place, but I did it in good conscience. I thought it was what I was supposed to do. I thought it's what God wanted me to do. That's not what he's saying here. He's saying, I've lived in good conscience before God until this day. And the high priest, Ananias, commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. And Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall, for you sit to judge me according to the law, and do you command me to be struck contrary to the law? You can't strike me according to the law you proclaim, not without a trial." And those who stood by said, "Do you revile God's priest?" And Paul said, "I did not know, brethren, that he was the high priest, for it's written, you shall not speak evil of the ruler." So he condescended here. He says, if I had known it was the high priest who told you to strike me in the mouth, I would not have said anything, because I can't revile the high priest. I'll go by your Jewish law. When it doesn't violate God's law, I'll go by your Jewish law. I think it was a pretty smart thing Paul said right there. Paul's a pretty smart guy. Why didn't he know it was the high priest? Well, we're not in the home quarters. If we were at the home quarters of the Sanhedrin, high priest sitting up on a high chair, everybody knows it's the high priest. But he's just in among a bunch of people there. You can't tell one from the other. And so he didn't know it was the high priest. But when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees, the other part were Pharisees, he cried out in the council, "Men, brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead. I am being judged." And when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. What did he do? I can't beat them all, so I'll split them up. Paul's a smart fella. He not only knows more than one language, he's just a smart fella. He split them up. If I can't beat them all, then I'll split them up, and then I'll turn them against themselves and see what happens. So he did that. He said that I'm being judged because I believe in the resurrection of the dead, and the dissension rose between the Pharisees and Sadducees. The assembly was divided. The Sadducees say there is no resurrection, no angel, no spirit. Pharisees confess both. Then there arose a loud outcry, and the scribes of the Pharisees' party arose and protested, saying, "We find no evil in this man. But if the spirit or an angel has spoken to him, let us not fight against God." That sounds just like what Gamaliel said in an earlier chapter, speaking to the same assembly. You won't fight against God. If an angel has spoken to him, so be it. We're not going to fight against God. So they had the whole council against him. Paul split the council by his words, and now only half the council is against him. But they're still against him. The ones who were against him, they didn't give up the fight. But Paul uses this situation to take advantage of, at least for the moment, to accomplish his purpose. Paul, he says, these Sadducees oppose me because I teach what you teach according to the law. And there were things that, Pharisees come off with not a very good picture in the Gospels because of their protesting against Jesus all the time. But not everything the Pharisees did or taught was wrong. In fact, Jesus said, though, about the Pharisees one time, he says, what they tell you to do, do. It's their actions, their non-compliance themselves when they say one thing and do another. But the things they tell you to do, do that. They're not telling you wrong. They're just not telling you everything. So Paul, again, proclaims that he preaches Christ based upon the resurrected Christ who appeared to him in a vision. He gets the sympathy of the Pharisees. Again, Sadducees don't back down. The meeting turns violent. Lysias, the commander, takes Paul into custody again. In Acts chapter 23, verse 10 and following, Luke records that the Jewish leaders, these highly ethical men, which they're not, the same ones that tried to illegally crucify Jesus and were successful in that, they plotted an ambush for Paul the next day. They were going to ask Lysias to bring Paul down to the Jewish headquarters. We met on your turf. Bring him down here. Let us talk to him privately, Paul, or the leader said. And so Lysias was going to do that, but found out that there was going to be a attempted coup, so to speak. When they bring him down to the Jewish headquarters, there were going to be some people who were going to interrupt those proceedings and kill Paul. So Lysias decided, you know what, I'm not going to do that. And he sneaks Paul out of town and goes to Caesarea. Who knows where Caesarea is? You got Jerusalem, and I don't have a picture of the map. I should have brought one. You got Jerusalem basically in the middle of the country. Caesarea is over on the Mediterranean coast up to the north. Well, maybe I do have a picture. Yeah, Paul and Caesarea. This is the Mediterranean Sea. This is still in Judea, but it's on the coast. I'll show you how bad an artist I am.
I got a map here.
This is Mount Carmel right here. This is Jerusalem over here. This is the Mediterranean Sea here. You go on around over here, way over here, you'll find Italy. That's a long way away. This is Jerusalem here, Bethlehem here, and Caesarea is going to be on the coast over here somewhere. That's where this is. Herod the Great, I think it was, built Caesarea. He made it some kind of place. And this is the ruins of it now. But most likely, if you can see a restoration of this, which we don't have, but there are some mocks of it like that temple in Jerusalem, most likely Paul is going to be imprisoned right here in this area, maybe in this area here. But this is where the political part of it was. This over here is like a horse racing place that he built. This is an amphitheater. It was a wonderful, wonderful place, a big seaport there. At any rate, this is where Paul comes to prison, and he will remain for the next 2 years. And before we get into that, I'm going to go ahead and take a 5-minute break, so that you can get your drink or go to the restroom, and we'll come back in 5 minutes and pick up there. I'm required to take a break between the hours.
What y'all gonna do about the class?
For those of you who are on the recording, I'm going to continue to let the recording go for 5 minutes. So ignore all the conversations that you may or may not hear.
You will tell him when he comes.
I can see you in the class now out there online. Can you hear me? I can't hear you, so you have to wave at me or something if you hear me. All right, good. I'm glad to hear it. I wish I could hear you, but I don't have any way of doing that. But at least you're hearing me. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and we'll come back.
I'm gonna tell the other instructor I'm gonna be coming back to class.
Okay.
Tell him.
Huh? This class, I mean,
This one. I said, if I split this class, I'll be so confused. I'm trying to do.
I don't know why y'all tell me where I'm going to study the Bible, when I leave, I left my Bible at home. And I did the same thing last week. I picked up everything but the Bible.
Yeah.
And I read the Bible for 2 to 3 hours every night.
Well, we all make mistakes, like you said. Now, both the ladies standing there?
No, my wife's coming back.
Okay. So did you find Caesarea?
Yeah, I got a map right in the back.
It's about where I had it.
Yeah, Damascus and in between Damascus and Jerusalem.
Yep.
No, Tyre. Sidon. It's real. Yeah. Been there too?
Ma'am?
Been so
Sir? Yes, I have. Several years ago, somebody said they wanted to pay for me a trip to go over there. And I said, no, I got my Bible. That's all I need. He said, no, I want you to go. So I didn't want to offend him. I went. And it was one of the best trips I ever took. Not just to Caesarea, but we went to Caesarea, we went to Jerusalem, we went to, well, all over what's called the Holy Land. And just being there and seeing some of the things where it was and what they did,
things that reported happened there.
it really made a difference for me. I was impressed. Because I went thinking I would not be impressed that, you know, dirt's dirt wherever you go. But, and it is, but at the same time, I learned a lot. Had a guy.
Just think, at one time you was only walking on Holy Land. And sometimes they said this ground is holy. Like walking on some of that.
They believed it was holy, and it was the place where Jesus welcomed. You know, we don't, that whole country is surrounded by a coastline of the Mediterranean Sea. It's never said that Jesus went down to the coastline. He probably did take some of those coastal ways to get from one place to the other. But apparently the beach wasn't where Jesus wanted to be. All right, so Paul left Jerusalem. They were going to, we're over here in Jerusalem, and they were going to take, the plan was for Lysias to take Paul down to the Jewish headquarters, but the Jews didn't think Paul would ever make it because they were going to kill him.
Right.
They had some thugs that they had hired, the nice guys that they were. They had some thugs they were hired that were going to kill him. So Lysias learned about that, actually, I think, from Paul's nephew. As a result, Lysias changed his mind. He sends Paul by night. This is not the first time Paul was snuck out of Jerusalem. When Paul first became a Christian, he had to sneak him out. They took him over the wall in a basket. Anyway, they sneak him out of Jerusalem and to Caesarea. This is essentially the headquarters of Rome in their Judean province. And it's a pretty special place. Herod had made it a pretty special place. He made it that way with Roman money. But nevertheless, he made it a pretty significant place. Herod was a great builder. But at any rate, Paul goes to Caesarea. He stays there for 5 days, awaiting for his accusers to come. Finally, his accusers did come. The high priest Annas, some Jewish elders came with him, and Tertullus, a Jewish lawyer, at least a lawyer for the group of the Jews. And when they arrived, Felix had a hearing, and Tertullus argued that Paul had, in Jerusalem, disturbed the peace. He incited riots in Jerusalem, and that there was a pretty serious charge, especially during one of the high holy days. Governor Felix, along with the Roman peacekeeping force, it was their responsibility to keep the peace. And if Paul was there starting riots, and we want to get rid of Paul, we want to get rid of the rabble-rouser. So they made the charge. Paul is a rabble-rouser. He's just there causing trouble. We need to stop him. And so Felix said, okay, well, we need to hear what Paul's side of the story was. They also accused Paul of trying to violate the temple, bringing that Gentile man into the temple. The thing is, in this accusation, no one stepped up to say, I saw it. Now, I don't know why that is, because the Jews, they're not afraid to lie when the lie suits them. It seems to, not Jews in general, but these Jewish leaders. They're not afraid to lie when a lie suits them, but apparently this was serious enough that if they are caught in this lie, they're going to be in a heap of trouble, so they're not wanting to stick their neck. They don't like Paul, they hate Paul, but they're not going to stick out their neck so far they're going to get it cut off by trying to kill Paul. So nobody steps up. And because there were no witnesses, and because there couldn't be any witnesses, because Paul didn't do it, Tertullus, I think he is convinced that Paul does hate Judaism. He believes that if Paul will confess himself or speak himself, he will betray himself. So I think Tertullus sort of wants Paul to speak. Tertullus doesn't know Paul very well, apparently, but he wants Paul to speak because he thinks Paul will compromise himself in his speech. Well, listen to what Paul said in his speech in Acts chapter 2. What do I do with my clicker? Well, I'll do it this way. Acts chapter 2. What do I do with that thing?
Did you go out? I can check. Did you go to a room?
I'll be right back. I put it in the office.
Peace and government.
Oh, I know where to do it. I put it on the chalkboard. Acts chapter 2, beginning in verse 42, he said, and when he was called upon, when Paul was called upon, Tertullus, or actually this is Tertullus, Tertullus began his accusation saying, seeing that through you, speaking to Felix, seeing, he's kind of buttering the toast here, he's trying to, for seeing that through you we enjoy such great peace and prosperity is being brought to the land by your wonderful foresight, we accept it in all ways and all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. Nevertheless, not to be tedious to you any further, I beg you to hear by your courtesy a few words from us. For we have found this man, Paul, a plague, a creator of dissension among the Jews through the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, which he was not anything associated with the Nazarenes. Anyway, he had tried to profane the temple. We seized him. We wanted to judge him according to our law, but the commander Lysias came by and with great violence took him out of our hands, commanding his accusers to come to you. By examining him yourself, you may ascertain these things of which we accuse him. So rather than say we have a witness, rather than say that we can prove this, we want you to question him yourself so that he will basically be caught in his own speech. Paul, he's not a lawyer, but he does give a speech here, a very compelling speech, and in it he's going to have 4 main points. Number 1, you have no witnesses against me. There's no basis in your charge against me, and there could not be any witnesses because he did not do it. Number 2, it was argued, he'll rightly argue that it was Jews from Asia who had disturbed the peace. I didn't do that. They came starting a fight where there was no fight. I was being peaceable. I was taking a vow with the Jews, and I was just doing the Jewish thing, and these Jews from Asia came in and did this, and this was confirmed by a letter from Lysias that accused the Jews of planning to assassinate Paul. Number 3, Paul's going to say that I've done nothing to deserve being accused of defiling the temple. I did not incur a riot or to start a riot, nor did I defile the temple. On the contrary, I tried to worship in the temple. Number 4, Paul reminded the court that the Sanhedrin court in Jerusalem had not found him guilty of anything. I spoke to you guys twice, and all you did is say, I did this, but nobody proved anything. Nobody said, there was no verdict passed down that Paul did anything. And so, with all this evidence, I don't know why we're here, essentially. If there were evidence, they would have sought to have him executed and would have accomplished that. Now, Felix, I think in God's providence, because we have to look at the bigger picture, and that brings us back to the story that we're trying to get to. Why is Paul in prison and writing these letters? The bigger picture is God wants Paul to go to Rome. Now, Paul could have been picked up by the hair of the head like, Ezekiel, and taken. But God had a means through which he wanted Paul to go to Rome. There's a purpose behind that, and we'll see that as this continues to go on. But in that purpose, in that providence, I think God has Felix on the throne here, and God knows that Felix is not an honest man. He's not a good man.
Was Felix a Jew?
Felix is the
governor.
He's the governor appointed by Rome. I'm assuming he's not Jewish. Herod would be the Jewish ruler, and Herod and Felix sort of have sister thrones there in Jerusalem, or in here in where are we? Caesarea. But if Felix was an honest man, he would have heard Paul's argument and said, you know what, you're right. You don't deserve to be here, go home. But it's not a dishonest man. He decides, you know what, let me think about this. And thinks about it for 2 years, hoping to gain something from Paul. That's right. Listen to what happened. Verse 24. I think is our next. Well, I have there Paul's, essentially what we were talking about, Paul's argument. I'm not going to go back and read that. We basically said what's there. This is Paul's 4 points that he makes. And then in verse 24, and after some days when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, for those of you who are watching online, that's Acts chapter 24, verse 10 down through verse 21. That's Paul's argument in his defense that we just discussed a moment ago. Acts 24, 10 through 21. And then beginning in verse 24, after some days when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. Now he reasoned about righteousness, that is, Paul reasoned about righteousness, self-control, judgment to come. Felix was afraid, answered, Paul, go away, for when I have a convenient season, I'll call for you. Meanwhile, he hoped that money would be given him by Paul. He's not interested in what Paul has to say about righteousness and judgment and self-control. You must be an important man, Paul. All these people hate you, and leader of the Christians. You must have lots of money. Maybe you can scratch my palm. Hope that Paul, he would be giving money by Paul that he might release him. Therefore, he sent for him to more often converse with him. Paul, come on in. Tell me about that gospel again. Tell me about that Jesus again. Oh, by the way, have you found any money to get out? But after 2 years, Porcius Festus succeeded Felix. He expired his term. Felix wanted to do the Jews a favor, left Paul bound. He wasn't interested in anything concerning truth. He just wanted money, didn't get it, so he just left Paul bound. According to Acts chapter 25, I'm trying to move through this very quickly because we need to get to the point where we're actually getting into the book of Ephesians. According to Acts 25, Festus took his seat as governor, and according to historians, in AD 59, Paul's Jewish opponents saw another opportunity to kill Paul. They planned an ambush, petitioned Festus to deliver Paul to Jerusalem. This is 2 years later. 2 years ago, they tried to kill Paul when Paul was in Jerusalem, and here, bring him from the commander's house or location down to the temple or the Jewish location, and in the process we'll kill him. That didn't work out. So now 2 years later, they're still steaming mad. And these guys really hate Paul. 2 years later, Paul's been rotting in jail for nothing. He proved his innocence, but Felix didn't let him go. And so now that a new ruler's come to the throne, maybe we can persuade him. So these angry Jews say, bring him down to Jerusalem. Let us have a discussion with him, and we'll handle it down here so that you don't have to mess with it anymore. Festus convened a hearing, asked Paul if he'd be willing to do this, and what Paul said. One of the famous phrases. Well, let's look at verse 25, or chapter 25, verse 9 beginning. Festus wanted to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, are you willing to go to Jerusalem and be judged before me concerning these things? There be judged before me concerning these things. Paul said, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat. I've been brought here for that purpose, waited 2 years. I'm going to go to Caesar, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews, I have done no wrong. I've proven my case. There's nothing they have against me. We've talked about this 2 years ago, and for 2 years I've talked about this. If I'm offended or have committed anything deserving of death, I do not object to dying. But if there is nothing in these things which these men accuse me, no one can deliver me to them. You can't do this to me, Festus. By law, you can't do that. I appeal to Caesar. I'm a Roman citizen. I appeal to Caesar. And Festus says, buddy, you appeal to Caesar you will go. That's the law of the Romans, and Festus wasn't about to get entangled with that. He wasn't going to end up on Caesar's plate, so he says, you want to go to Caesar? Buddy, you can have it. And that's what begins to happen at this point. Paul didn't have any hope to be released. He knew from prophecy, in fact, that he was going to Rome, and he knew that nothing good would come of him being sent back to Jerusalem. So he, having heard that there was a Jewish plot, he decided, I'll go to Rome. I'll appeal to Caesar. The Lord had appeared to Paul himself in a dream in Acts chapter 23, saying that he would live to proclaim the gospel. And I'm not going to die, Paul, but you are going to go to Rome. In fact, I think I have that on the screen. But the following night, the Lord stood by him and said, be of good cheer, Paul, for as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must bear witness for me in Rome. That's God's plan. That's what God wants to happen. I want to get you in Rome, Paul. And we'll find out more about that, especially when we look at the book of Philippians as to why God was so insistent upon getting Paul to Rome. But he wanted Paul in Rome. This is part of your mission. This is part of your responsibility that I've given you. I want you to go to Rome so you will live. You're not going back to Jerusalem, because there they will kill you if you go back. Before Paul was sent to Rome, he had the opportunity to explain to his case before King Herod Agrippa II. And after hearing his arguments, and Agrippa said to Festus, "Why is he here? You should have let this guy go 2 years ago." Had he not appealed to Caesar, Herod said, he would be free. But he's appealed to Caesar, so to Caesar he must go. And that brings us to, in Acts chapter 28, we find that Paul did go to Rome. The trip from Caesarea to Rome is covered in Acts chapters 27 and 28. Start out in Caesarea. They go through several ports. You might recall from your reading the book of Acts, we won't go into all that they went from spot to spot to spot, ran into a big storm, a 14-day storm, ended up shipwrecked on the island of Malta. What happened on the island of Malta? Anybody remember?
So they got poison.
He got bit by a snake, and he didn't die. People thought he would die. He didn't die, and because he didn't die, they thought, "Oh, you must be some kind of god." Paul used that as an opportunity to teach the gospel on Malta. He healed the chief of Malta, healed his father from a disease that he had, and then all of Malta brought their sick folk to Paul to heal. Said that if his shadow went over them, that he would heal them. They touched his handkerchief or whatever, he would heal them. This is where Benny Hinn got his idea, but we're not going to talk about him. But at any rate, Paul did a great evangelism there on Malta. And it may be that this was part of God's plan. This is the way that Malta was going to hear the gospel. Paul's on his way to Rome. Here, let me cause an Euroclydon, a storm, and shipwreck this boat here on Malta, and Paul can teach the gospel there. Then we come to, they finally get to Rome after several other stops, and Paul dwelt 2 whole years in his own rented house and received all who came to him, preaching the kingdom of God, teaching the things which concern the Lord Jesus Christ with all confidence, no one forbidding him. So the prison time that he spent in Rome, it wasn't behind bars.
House arrest, huh?
It's under house arrest, essentially. He's waiting on his trial, and because he's a Roman citizen, I guess he gets some preferential treatment. He's chained to a guard. It's not like he's in a luxury hotel here. We'll find, I think, in the book of Philippians that he was chained to a guard 24/7. But if he's chained to a guard 24/7, it's not the same guard. That guard shifts every so many hours, let's say 6 or 8 hours. He gets a new guard. What's Paul going to do with that guard in 6 or 8 hours? He's going to teach him the gospel. And many of Caesar's household heard the gospel because Paul being chained to that guard for the next duration of time that he's in the prison. So Paul makes it to Rome. He's able to preach the gospel boldly and without hindrance over the next the duration of the time that he's in Rome. That's why God was trying to get Paul there, because had Paul come to Rome as a missionary, as he was doing from city to city before, had he gone, he might never have met some of the people that he met. He met high-ranking folks while he was in prison in Rome. He met people who were next to Caesar's own household, that were either taught or converted into Christ, that he probably wouldn't have met had he just come down the streets of Rome. And so I think God providentially took Paul the way he did, because this, in my opinion, God leaves no stone unturned to find any soul that is willing to hear. And Paul was able to find souls and reach souls that he would not have ordinarily reached under normal circumstances. So what did Paul do while he was in prison? Well, obviously he preached the gospel to the people who came by his house. Some of these were Jews, some of these were believing Jews, some of these were unbelieving Jews. He preached the gospel to those people. He spent his time working with, I think, the Roman citizens that he had access to. And we can find in the book of Acts several things that teach us how Paul conducted himself. I don't know if I got all these scriptures up here. No, I don't. So that's the last screen that I have. But Paul his whole life is dedicated to teaching the gospel. And again, he says, if I'm bound, I'll teach the gospel while I'm bound. If I die, I'll teach the gospel in my death. And later on, in Paul's second imprisonment in Rome, he does most likely actually die. Some people say he didn't because the Bible doesn't actually ever say. But when he writes the book of 2 Timothy, the book of 2 Timothy is basically Paul's swan song. I'm going to die.
Yeah, that was beautiful.
Yeah, I'm going to die. And Timothy was weakening, wavering. He loved Paul, been around him for 20 years. And Timothy was, this is not a book on Timothy, so I can't spend any time there, but Timothy needed encouragement. And so Paul wrote this second letter to Timothy. He said, man, don't give up the ship. Don't give up the faith. Continue to speak boldly. I'm not afraid. Don't be ashamed of me because I'm going to go die. I'm not ashamed. The Lord has laid up for me a crown of righteousness, and I'm going to go get it. And so he was, as you said, it's a very beautiful letter, a very strong, encouraging letter for Timothy. In Acts chapter 23, verse 11, I think it's the theme, I guess, of or what had to stay in the back of Paul's mind, where the Spirit says, or God says, take courage. You have testified about me in Jerusalem. You will testify about me in Rome. What else did Paul do? He was a preacher in prison. What else did he do while in prison?
Tent maker. No, he didn't
Well,
make tents.
while he's in prison, he wasn't making tents. He was a tent maker, but that's not what he did. He was a man of prayer. We'll find this as we read the books of the letters of the Ephesians and Philippians and Colossians. I thought I had these scriptures on here. I don't know why I don't. But in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 19, it says, he says to the Ephesians, I want you to pray for me, that the utterance may be given me, that I may open my mouth boldly to make known the mystery of the gospel. I'm in prison. And this is not easy for me. Although I know why I'm here, still I'm chained to a Roman guard. There are people here who don't like me, and I need courage. Pray for me, Paul says. Pray that I'll have the courage to speak the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in chains, that I may speak boldly as I ought to speak. To the Colossians, he said, continue earnestly in prayer. Colossians chapter 4, verse 2. Continue earnestly in prayer, being vigilant in it with thanksgiving, meanwhile praying also for us that God will open doors for the word to speak the mystery of Christ. Paul's in prison, and he's speaking to people who are free. He says, I need you to pray for me that God will open doors in these prison cells. He's not really in a cell, but give me open doors that I may have opportunity to preach the mystery of Christ, for which I am in chains, that I may make manifest the gospel as I ought to speak. So Paul is in prison, and he's praying or asking people to pray for him. I want you to pray that I'll have lots of money. I want you to pray that I'll have lots of freedom. I want you to pray that I have lots of luxuries. Is that what he's asking? No. Pray for me that I'll have opportunity to preach the gospel. Pray for me that I will see that opportunity when it comes, and pray for me that I will have the courage to speak when that time comes. So he asks for prayers. He's writing these letters, and he says, pray for me. But in these letters, we also find him praying himself. Probably in these letters are some of the strongest, and maybe even longest, prayers of the apostles, of the apostle Paul. He's praying for those people. He's the one in prison, but he's praying for the benefit of them, the strength of those congregations, that your love may abound more and more, he said to the Philippians, and more in knowledge and discernment, he said to the Philippians. He's praying that the Ephesians, that they will understand the things that they have truly been given. We'll talk about that in those letters. So he's a prisoner, he's a preacher, he's a prayer. He's also, in addition to his preaching and praying, Paul sees his ministry, his prison ministry, as a suffering on behalf of others. My suffering, he says, is going to benefit other people. He was willing This is the attitude of Jesus. Remember in Philippians chapter 2, Paul says, have the mind of Christ, have this mind in you, which was in Christ Jesus. And he went on to show how Jesus suffered. Why did Jesus suffer? For me. And Paul says, the suffering I'm going through. He was in prison. He was in his own rented house, but I don't think this is luxury accommodation. He was suffering. There was times when apparently he was without. The Philippians sent money so he might have food or have clothing or whatever. So there were times when it wasn't as nice as we might think it would have been in his own rented house. And there were times of suffering, but he says that in Philippians chapter 2, he says, I want you to know, brethren, Philippians chapter 1, verse 12, I want you to know, brethren, that the things which happened to me have actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel. So that it has become evident to the whole palace guard and to the rest that my chains are in Christ. And most of the brethren of the Lord have become confident because of my chains, much more bold to speak the word without fear. So there were preachers in Rome who were more able to speak or were able to speak more boldly because of what Paul was going through in Rome. I'm suffering, and it's not for my benefit. It's for the gospel and for other people. In Ephesians chapter 3, verse 13, he says, therefore I ask that you do not lose heart at my tribulations, because my tribulations are for your glory. In chapter 1, Colossians 1, verse 24, he gives us a strange thought. He says, I now rejoice in my sufferings for you, and fill up in my flesh what is lacking in the afflictions of Christ for the sake of his body, the church. That's a difficult passage to interpret. But essentially, I think what he's saying is the sufferings of Christ for his body didn't end on the cross. They continue in the lives of those who are his people today. The sufferings that we might go through today, I think we could say the same thing here that Paul says. It's Christ continuing to suffer. When Paul was, before he became Paul, he was still Saul, and he was persecuting Christians. What did Jesus tell him? Why are you persecuting me? Who was Paul persecuting? Christians, the church. But Jesus asked him, why are you persecuting me? And so Paul, I think he's seeing himself in that flip-flop there. It's now he that's being persecuted, but Paul said it's not me, it's Christ. They hate me, not because of me, they hate me because of Christ. And so he says, I understand why this has happened.
People hate you because of me.
He said that we're going to be hated. They hated me, they will hate you. And Paul came to understand that. So he preached in prison. He prayed for the churches. He asked the churches to pray for him. He suffered as an apostle. But the idea or the thing that we want to get to is that while he was in prison, he had this ministry of writing these letters. We started out last week talking about Bunyan, who was in prison in the 18th century, I think it was, because of his preaching without a license. And while he was in prison, he used that time to write letters, write pamphlets. And one of those pamphlets that he wrote was the book called The Pilgrim's Progress, famous book from years ago. But Paul has that mission. God says, I need you, these churches, Ephesus, not just Ephesus, but I think several churches around Ephesus, Philippi, Colossae, I think Hierapolis and Laodicea. You got copies of the letter to Colossae, and the young man or the man Philemon, they need this communication. So Paul, while you're here, while you're teaching the palace guard, while you're teaching the Christians in Rome, I need you to write these letters. And that's what Paul does. This is the essence of the ministry of Paul that we want to focus on in this class. Now, if we take these books, these letters, we call them books, the book of Colossians, the book of Philippians, the book of Ephesians, they're not books. They're letters. And if I can reteach myself not to call them books and to call them letters, I think I'll be better for it. We need to, they're letters. They're not books. But it's not a big thing, but it's something to help us understand what they are. There are some commonalities in these books, some doctrines, some theology that we can find that it tells that it's the same author who wrote them, and it seems to be a focus of Paul's life during that time that we can see emerge from these letters. With three main doctrines that you'll find cohesively in these letters is that Christ is king. He's king of creation. And this is emphasized throughout the letters. And as king, he has a relationship, number two, with those who are in the kingdom. Especially we'll see this in the book of Ephesians, but it's found in all the letters, the four letters that we're going to be looking at. Christ is king of the creation, and he has a relationship with those who are in his kingdom, which are otherwise referred to as the church. And in these letters, you'll find Paul teaching the church how they can live ethically as members of that kingdom. Christ is king. One. Number two, he has a kingdom. He has a relationship with that kingdom. And number three, here's how the people of that kingdom need to live, because they are children or citizens of that kingdom. I wanted to spend some time explaining those 3 points and seeing how that's pointed out, but we'll see that as we continue in the lessons. I want to, real quick, see if I can give us a introduction to the book of Ephesians. We've got about 25 minutes left in class. Let me see if I can do that, and we can hopefully start off in Ephesians chapter 1 next week. Just 1 second while I pull up my notes. I think here's my mouse. What does it mean? The more things change, the more they stay the same. Old proverb. It's not from the Bible, but the more things change, the more they remain the same. And we have a tendency to think that we're living in the worst of times. It's going to get worse and worse and worse. But what do you think people 100 years ago said?
Same thing.
We live in the worst of times. It's going to get worse and worse and worse. And if you think about people who lived in the time of, well, Hitler. You know, we have some bad things going on right now, school shootings and things of that nature that are really bad, and it's because it's in our face. It's our urgency. It's our problem. It's the worst thing. Things couldn't get any worse. But if we lived in Hitler's time and we're Jews, we'd be saying things just can't get any worse. And if we go back to Mussolini and we go back to the time of the Caesars and the Christians, you know, no matter when you live, you're going to say we live in the worst of times, and it's bad. Ours is situation is always the worse than anybody else's. The more things change, the more they stay the same. If you would compare today's time, let's say with the time of Paul as he's writing these letters. Let's think about the book of Ephesians, the people of the city of Ephesus. The city of Ephesus. If you were to compare what you know of people who lived in the city of Ephesus in, say, AD 57, 58, and the people of now, you probably don't know a lot about what happened, what they did back then, but just in your imagination, what you remember from history, from what you've heard in Bible studies, what were people like back then? What were their lives like, and how would it compare today? How would you, if you were to make a list, they were like this and we're like this, what would be the differences in those places or in those people's, you and them, or us and them?
At the time, really, but Ephesus was a metropolis.
It was pretty good metropolis. It was a coastal city. I don't know that people love the beach for the same reason that we love the beach today. I mean, people today, I don't know that they we get naked and we go to the beach, or we go to the beach and get naked today. I don't know that they did that back then. I just don't know. I don't know there's any evidence that they did, but that's what we do today. But it was a coastal city. And because it was a coastal city, it was a commercial city.
And a diverse city.
It was diverse. Corinth was like that. All those coastal cities were like that. And because they had sailors coming out of them, and because they had trade coming in and out of them, Ephesus was on one side of I think it's the Aegean Sea. On the other side, you had Corinth. And so there were ships going back and forth all the time trading, because all the stuff that would come from the east would come to Ephesus. All the stuff that would come from the west would come to Corinth. And, things would just swap over, and then they would go that direction. So it was an affluent city. Ephesus was, like Corinth was. It was I'm sorry?
Very religious.
Very religious city. And we'll talk about that as we get into the studies of the books, that it was very religious. And if you offended the gods, then woe be unto you, because we're not going to let you shop in our city, or we're not going to let you sell in our city if you're going to offend the gods. And so that became a problem for Christians. We'll see as we study. But there are a lot of, you think about technology and all the advances we have in technology today. What can we do with technology? I can show you the Bible on a screen. I can talk to these folks over in Rock Springs, Georgia, through this little microphone here and through this camera here, and Paul didn't have that ability. Folks in Ephesus back then, if they wanted to talk to somebody, they didn't have email, they didn't have much of a postal system. They had to go on their feet to get there. Mode of transportation and technology. I mean, think about medical. The advances that we have in medicine today. Back then, when they were practicing medicine. Practicing medicine was a whole. It was practicing. I mean, they'd cut somebody open, it was just awful. If you would think about comparing it, what it was back then to what it is today, it was just awful and significant in the differences. But at the same time, even though we're advanced, we are highly educated, we are easily transported from one place to the other. We know more medicine than they did. But when you boil it all down, people are still the same. We still have the same needs.
Yeah.
Still have the same desires. Those who are sick want to be healthy. Those who are poor want to be rich. Those who are violent want to do what? They want to do violence. Now, back then, a man might throw a spear and kill one man. Today, I can take a bomb, a missile, and blow up thousands of people. But it doesn't change. The means of it, the how of it changes, but the desire of it is still there.
Like when you talk, when we have conversations, our kids are just with anyone, and they start talking about the problems of the world. It's like, it's nothing. Go back to that, because if you go to the Bible, it's there. One
of the good things about the Bible is things are still the same.
Exactly.
I mean, the problems that David dealt with, people are still dealing with today.
Right.
And the same Bible that gives answer to David gives answer to us. The more things change, the more they remain the same. And that's the essence that I want you to get with this book. It's a 2,000-year-old letter that Paul wrote not only to the Ephesian church. Some say, and I'm not a scholarly enough to know the answer to this question, but some say that in the original manuscripts there was no the word Ephesus, where it says in Ephesians chapter 1, verse 1. What does it say? If you can get there faster than I am.
Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, by the will of God, to the saints who are in Ephesus.
To the saints who are in Ephesus. Some people say that word Ephesus there was not a part of the original text. It was sort of left blank. To the saints which are in blank. And this letter is a circular letter going to several churches in the Ephesus area. The city of Ephesus was a place where Paul did much work as a teacher in the school of Tyrannus. And those students would go, that he taught for 2 years or 3 years there in that school, would go into many areas. So I think this is a circular letter. Whether or not the name Ephesus was there or not is a matter of debate that I can't really answer. But I think it was a circular letter. And many of the people to whom Paul was going to write, he had never met. Like he had never met the Colossians. He never went to Colossae that we know of. So when he wrote the letter to Colossae, it's a letter he's writing to strangers. And I think for the most part, the people that received this letter of Ephesus were strangers to Paul. That's one of the things that we have in common with those people. We've never met Paul. We have to trust what the witnesses have said, what the proof has given, that Paul is an apostle of Jesus Christ and that his word is truth. So we have to trust the inspiration of the Holy Spirit just like they did back then. So this letter, written 2,000 years ago, addresses situations that existed 2,000 years ago, but because things still remain the same, humanity changes, technology changes throughout the years, but because things never really get any different, people are still hungry, people are still poor, people are still rich, people are still black, people are still white, people are still people, they still have the same needs, same desires. So the issues that they had in the Ephesus church or the Ephesians churches are going to be the same kind of emphasis or same kind of needs that we have today. I want to look at some of the demographics very quickly. We've got a few minutes left. We've got 15 minutes left to do this. I want to look at some of the demographics of those people and compare them to us. Look in chapter 1. I have it on the screen here. They were Christians. It says the saints in Ephesus. That's saints, meaning they were Christians. They were the faithful in Christ. They were people who were adopted as his sons through Jesus Christ. They have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins. These are people who heard the word of truth, believed, and were sealed with the Holy Spirit. That's what they were. What about us today? We're the same. So Paul was writing to Christians then. He's writing to Christians now. Chapter 2 says they were people who were alive together with Christ. Is that us? The Bible says it is. They were people who were saved by grace through faith. Is that us? Yeah. There were people who were in Christ Jesus, brought near by the blood. Is that us? Yes, it is. They were fellow citizens, members of the household of God. That's who Paul is writing to when he writes this letter initially. He's still writing to folks like that today. This letter, by the power of God, comes to us just like that 2,000 years later. In chapter 4, we see they were people who had received the calling. They were people who had learned Christ. They were people who were members of the body. Any difference? More things change, what? Will they stay the same? Chapter 5, it says they were God's holy people. They were children of light. Chapter 6, it says they were given the full armor of God. They loved the Lord Jesus with an undying love. So he's talking to us, just like he was talking to them. That the descriptions that we can find of the people then are the same descriptions of Christians today. So this letter is written to us. Another thing that we have in common with them is they were Gentiles. First of all, they were Christians. Secondly, they were Gentiles. Now, I can look at you and you can look at me and you can know that we're not Jews.
Mhm.
Now, there are Jews today, and the letter still would apply to them, but for the most of us, we're Gentiles. It says in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 11, therefore remember that at one time you Gentiles in the flesh called uncircumcision by that which is called circumcision, which is made by the hands. In Ephesians chapter 3, verse 1, he says, for this reason I, Paul, the prisoner of Jesus Christ, for you Gentiles. The important point is they were Gentiles who became Christians. They were, and so were we. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 1, it says, and you were dead in your trespasses and sin. You walked according to the course of this world. You followed the prince of power of the air, the spirit that now works in the sons of disobedience, among whom you once lived in passions of your flesh, carrying out the desires of the body of the mind, which were by nature, you were then by nature children of wrath, like the rest of mankind. That's what you were. But what are you now? It says in chapter 2, verse 12, I didn't put that enough there, that at that time you were without Christ, you were alien from the commonwealth of Israel, you were a stranger from the covenant of promise, you had no hope, you were without God in this world. Verse 18, chapter 4. Now this I say and testify in the Lord Jesus, that you must no longer walk like the rest of the Gentiles do, in the futility of their mind, darkened, alienated from the life of God, ignorant, hardness of heart. They become calloused and have given themselves to sensuality, greedy, practice every kind of impurity. That's what you were. When we go out into the world to teach the gospel, that's what we're going to run into. People who are like this. We're trying to bring them to the light. We're trying to bring them into Christianity. But before we bring them into Christianity, this is them. Just like it was you before you became a Christian. Just like it was us before we became a Christian. They owed everything to the saving grace of God. It says in Ephesians 2, verse 4, God being rich in mercy, because of his great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in trespass and sin, made us alive together with Christ. By grace have you been saved. So they were Christians. They were Gentiles who had become Christians. They were people who lived like Gentiles before they became Christians. They were people who owed everything they had in Christ to the saving work of Jesus Christ. And as we mentioned earlier, there were people who had heard of Paul, but had never met Paul. There were people who struggled, or they were husbands, there were wives, there were children, there were parents, just like you're a wife, you're a husband. Paul's writing to those people. He's going to talk to wives, he's going to talk to husbands, he's going to talk to children, he's going to talk to parents. Not just in Ephesus 2,000 years ago, but now in Atlanta, Georgia, today. They struggle with relationships and morality and culture. As Christians, they had to learn how to live in the new society. They had learned how to live according to the world. Now they got to learn a new society. They had to be schooled, we'll learn in Ephesians chapter 4, schooled in Christ so that they can become the household of the family of God. They didn't grow up in the church. Now, maybe you did, but a lot of folks didn't. They battled Satan at every turn and needed courage and weapons to fight him effectively. So then and now they were Christians, we are Christians. Then and now they were Gentiles, we are Gentiles, and they lived like Gentiles before they became Christians, owe everything to Christ Jesus. They were suffering, we're about out of time, so I'm going to just breeze through this. They were suffering from a lack of spiritual self-confidence. We'll see that. They were suffering from a lack of spiritual understanding. Paul will pray for their understanding. The letter indicates that they also suffer from a lack of spiritual maturity. He'll pray for their maturity. We'll see that they suffered from in their relationships. Paul will talk to them, especially about parents and husbands and wives and their relationships. So it's a book that was for them and their needs, but our needs are no different today. And I want you to see that as we begin the book, is not, we're going to go word by word and verse by verse, and we're going to be talking about them, but we're not just talking about them.
Right.
This letter is written to you.
That's right.
You could just take out the word Ephesus and put your name there. It's written to you by the same Apostle Paul, who is the apostle of Jesus Christ and his word hasn't changed. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Brother, this book is a book of God, or a letter from God. Inspired by the Holy Spirit, written by the Apostle Paul, but it's written to people 2,000 years ago. It's written for us, and we need to sink our teeth into it and see what the Holy Spirit is saying to you and I today. And next week, that's exactly what we're going to start doing. We're going to look at the calling that they received, which is the calling that we have received. We're going to look at the teachings and applications that Paul intended them to have, and we're going to make application to us today. So we're not just going to look at an ancient letter. We're going to look at a living letter. 2,000 years old, but it is alive. It is the sword of the Spirit. It continues to cut, to convict, and we need to see it as that. Any questions? I would like to ask questions from the folks out in, I think it's Rock Springs, but I can't hear your questions, and I apologize for that. Do y'all have a microphone system there, or is it just not working? Is my computer not working? You can't answer that question, can you? But anyway, we'll try to work on that for next week. If you have questions, my email, I've sent you emails concerning the class, concerning the recording. You can write those questions on those emails. I'll send you some questions about tonight's lesson. I hope it's been profitable to you. I hope you enjoyed the class, and I hope you'll enjoy the class over the next few weeks. You guys got any questions here?
No, very good.
All righty.
Thank you.
Good to have you guys in class in Rock Springs. Is it Rock Springs? Rock Springs Road. Churchback. Good to have you guys in class. Hope to see you next week. And I'll send you an email with the recording link so that you can watch the recording if you need to watch it. I only have one address for the Rock Springs Church. Now, there may be some of you who want an individual a link to your own individual emails. My email, I'll go ahead and give it to you, is M-I-K-E. You're showing me something and I can't see it. Your camera's behind you somewhere. Your camera's behind you. There you go. I see a blank piece of paper. I can't see what it says. Will send. Okay. Y'all send me your emails and I'll send you mine. Well, I can't send you mine until I have yours. But mine is Mike and Janine, MikeandJanine, CDCOC at gmail.com. I'll give that to you again. MikeandJanine, it's Chestnut Drive, Church of Christ, what it is.
Chestnut Drive.
At gmail.com. I could put it up on that screen there, couldn't I? I should have done that. Be easier for you. All right, guys, I'll see you next week. I'll send you a link. And
Yeah, I have your email anyway.
you have my email, that's right. I'll see you next week. Appreciate you being in class.
I sent a letter to Chestnut Drive one time.
I'm sorry?
I sent a letter to Chestnut